Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches, dependiendo de la hora en que ustedes nos estén escuchando. Bienvenidos sean ustedes a Grado Cero. Y pues hoy tenemos el gusto de poder entrevistar a uno de los grandes pensadores del siglo XX, del principio del siglo XX, que es el profesor David Harvey, y pues vamos a platicar mucho sobre su trabajo. Professor Harvey, first question I would like to ask you. For you, what is the city?
I tend to think of the city in a political sense rather than simply in a physical sense, because there is a process of urbanization which is now so spread out, so vast, that to imagine that there is some thing there called the city is kind of seems not appropriate. But at the same time, I think that the idea of the city is terribly important, and it's connected to the idea of citizenship. It's connected to the idea that we're attached to some specific kind of place, and politically we try to organize that space and that place around us in a way which is amenable to meeting our own wants, needs and desires, at the same time as we're also battling with the fact that those spaces and places are being built over by capital, because capital is seeking to find profitable ways to use space and place, and profitable uses don't necessarily add up to creating the use values that ordinary people would rely upon to construct a decent life in a decent living environment.
You're one of the first authors I read that talk about the rights of the city. Which kind of rights? What kind of rights are these?
I think the idea of the right to the city is about populations that are essentially disempowered, seeking to create sufficient political force to transform the living conditions in which they find themselves. Some people interpret the right to the city as a right of access to something that already exists. I tend to want to use it in a creative way and say the right to the city is the right to transform the world around us in a way which is more amenable to our wants, needs and desires.
As I told you when I met you, I'm a big fan of your work, and in your work there's some kind of contradiction when you start first reading it. You talk about the city as a space of hope, but also as a space of capital, where obviously there is not much hope. How can we understand this contradiction?
I'm very intrigued sometimes by the way in which capital builds certain spaces, and then the population appropriates those spaces in ways which kind of capital never had in mind. So there's a constant kind of battle. Because part of what makes a city and city life interesting are other citizens and what they do. And the city then becomes a space of encounter. And while capital can control some aspects of real estate and all the rest of it, and can try and use the state to control what people do in the streets and public spaces, it's never totally in control. And that's why I think about the city as a space of hope. And we're seeing now, even in the United States, progressive city administrations backed by progressive political organizations starting to sort of say, okay, we can reconstruct some of the things going on in our cities in ways which are much more amenable to what the population wants and needs.
Seems to me that when you first start working about the city, and this work about the city took you to talk about neoliberalism, how they are related, how they work together?
I think in some ways there was a crisis of urbanization towards the end of the 1960s. And there was a huge movement of discontent with the qualities of urban life. And so, for example, here in Mexico City, the student movement and the uprising of '68 and the killings of '68 was a key moment, I think, in which certain questions about the nature of urban life came to the forefront. And I think neoliberalism, to some degree, was an attempt to, if you like, control that upsurge of anger and disappointment with the qualities of urban living, and meet certain needs by creating an atmospherics of freedom and individuality and entrepreneurialism in oneself and all of those kinds of things, at the same time as it was used to try to promote the market economy. So it was a co-optation in some ways. Neoliberalism in some ways was a co-optation of the spirit of '68 through saying basically you want liberty and freedom. Liberty and freedom is guaranteed to you through the market, so join the market and you will have it, liberty and freedom. Of course, we now know that that was a lie, and that join the market means that you get exploited, not that you are more free. And some individuals benefited obviously from the neoliberal turn, but most people did not.
I know that you come to Mexico for a short time, but it's a question that I can avoid. When you see Mexico, you see a city that is near to a city with rights, or near a city that is near to an urban revolution.
Yes.
What do you see in Mexico?
I always feel when I'm in Mexico City that it's on the edge, that it's there's a ferment, and that it may explode. I have that feeling. I don't know why I have that feeling, but I do. Just in the streets and around, to the degree I get out into the city, I kind of get this feeling. And of course, Mexico has this revolutionary tradition. I mean, I think it's a fantastic revolutionary tradition. And as we know about other revolutionary traditions in the world, these revolutionary traditions have the habit of resurrecting at certain moments and exploding. And I think that Mexico is therefore a fascinating place. And I think particularly now that you have a new administration and a new direction, it's going to be a very interesting, and it's in a sense in opposition to much of what's going on in the rest of the world. And I think so it's a very exciting moment to sort of be close to Mexico.
2 years ago, near 2 years ago or 3, you released a series of videos about the capital of Marx.
Yes.
I understand that you are a late reader of Marx. You started reading it near to 40 years.
Yeah, right.
Now that Marx is over 100 years, what do you think? Do you think that Marx is still necessary? Do you think we overcome his work? What do you see that is promissory about reading Marx today?
Well, I think it's important to understand that Marx wrote a theory of capital and how does capital work. And of course we still live in a world where capital dominates. Actually, if you look at it, the form of capital that Marx analysed when he was writing only existed in Western Europe, Britain and the Eastern Seaboard of the United States and maybe a few outlying cities. But now that form of capital is dominant everywhere. So you could argue that Marx is far more important now than he was back when he wrote Capital, because capital now dominates everything everywhere. The only thing is that in reading Marx, it's very important to recognize that the whole story of what he's writing about is not simply contained in the first volume of Capital, which talks about the production process. He has some incredibly interesting arguments, which he never finished, about finance and what the financial system will look like. In fact, he had this great line where he recognizes, as he starts to go and analyze the role of finance, that finance is necessary, and not only is it necessary, but that it is going to become more significant. And he said at some point or other, we will arrive at a point where an accumulation of wealth is measured in terms of an accumulation of debt. And that is an astonishing kind of observation, because since the 1970s, global indebtedness has soared hugely. And that global indebtedness has, of course, been associated with an increasing concentration of wealth and income in a very, very small sliver of people in the top 1% or top 0.1% in the global economy. So Marx's kind of commentary about that sort of intrigues me, and why would he think that? And why would he think this would be the inevitable point to which capital would converge? And why are we now living at that point? So there's a sense in which what Marx guessed at and thought about through his analysis of capital is more relevant today because capital is so dominant in almost everything we do.
In 2003, you wrote a book that is one of our favorites, yours, in which you talk about the postmodernity. And the first question I have is, near the same time you wrote this book about postmodernity, appears the book of Friedrich Jansson about the postmodernity as a cultural term.
Right.
You also talk about a cultural term, but it's not the same kind.
No.
What do you think are your differences with Jansson and your work?
Well, the difference is that I understood the political economic base of what this postmodern term was about. That I was exceedingly critical of it and did not see it as liberatory. I saw it as leading into sort of a more imprisonment. It was not emancipatory at all. I think what Fred Jameson did was to sort of celebrate in some ways the cultural turn, and there was something to celebrate about it, but my view was it was celebratory, but it was going to be turned against itself. Yeah. And of course capital has a long history of doing that. I mean, I think about the history of the internet. Initially the internet was seen as a vehicle of human liberation, seen as a possibility of peer-to-peer action, seen as sort of something which is a utopianism of the future. And now you look at the internet and what do you see? You see Google, you see Facebook, you see tremendous concentrations of economic power and some extremely rich people at the top, and suddenly something that looked like it was kind of individualized and personalized and liberatory has become an instrument of surveillance and domination and all the rest of it. And I felt the same about the postmodern cultural turn, that yes, there's a sort of a promise of something there, and Jameson, I think, was very alert to the promise and excited by the promise and all this sort of thing. And I'm kind of going, wait a minute, when you look at the political economy of it, it isn't going to be so liberatory after all. So I was kind of negating, or trying to negate in some ways, all of this euphoria about the postmodern turn, and Fred Jameson was kind of very much in the...
Though still there is positive things about the internet.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not, but the difficulty is that these positive things get taken up by capital, and then they get turned into their opposite, which is they become a form. I mean, in the condition of postmodernity, for example, one of the things I was dealing with was the great excitement on the left of something called flexible specialization, in which workers could, move around and do this kind of thing. It was outside of the Fordist model of kind of... So there was a lot of excitement on the left on flexible specialization. And I said, no, I'm going to call it flexible accumulation, because this is a strategy of capital to further dominate workers, not a strategy of workers to free themselves from capital. So I was aware of a lot of these things and pursued them. Which again is not to say that I'm totally against flexibility. That would be the wrong way. I'm not totally against the internet either, but I see what's happened to it now, and you kind of go, hey, this was not as liberatory as we thought.
Years later, you wrote a really interesting book named The Story of Neoliberalism. What did you learn from the book about postmodernity to the story of neoliberalism? How do you change, or is it the same person? The same thing?
In a sense, it's the same thing. It's just that when I wrote The Condition of Postmodernity, I couldn't quite see and grasp all of the meanings of all of the things going on around me. The rise of Thatcherism and things of that kind. I didn't quite understand their significance. I think in retrospect, what I was writing about in The Condition of Postmodernity was about the initiation of the neoliberal turn, but that I wasn't able to call it that. And it was only much later that I could look back on it and say, oh, yeah, there was this connectivity, and then now I can synthesize it around the concept of neoliberalism, in which the postmodern turn was a precursor, if you like, of what is going on, even to the point where right now I recall a comment by Terry Eagleton about postmodernism ends up being whoever tells the most compelling story and whoever shouts loudest commands the stage. And this was his kind of comment about postmodernism way back then. And I think of Donald Trump now, and I think, yeah, this is exactly what the postmodern turn ends up in, is fake news. We abandon absolute standards of truth. We take perspectives, and truths are effects of discourse. So you invent discourses, and then the truth is all relative to the discourse. And so Trump invents discourses like crazy. I mean, he's an incredible postmodern president.
Yes.
And then people kind of look at it and say, "This is not liberatory. This is stupidity." So I think it's.
And one of the other books I love of your work is the book you wrote about Paris, City of Modernity.
Yes.
And I don't know, I might be wrong, but I think that book is very influenced by Walter Benjamin. I see a lot of Benjamin in your work. Do you like Benjamin?
Yeah, I like Benjamin, but I don't see Benjamin in
when
I
you talk about the city, the way of the city.
Yeah.
I remain some parts of the book of the passages.
Right. No, I mean, there is an interesting kind of parallel. I once taught a course where we read Benjamin's passage and work and my book. They're complementary, really. I mean, Benjamin is much more interested in the spectacle and the kind of charisma of a world which has a certain kind of sensibility and feeling, and of course I'm much more interested in the political economy. So I'm kind of looking at who is building the housing, what's happening to the housing labourers, and this kind of thing. And Benjamin sometimes is interested in that too. But I think I wouldn't say that one influenced the other, but that they are parallel.
And when you see Latin America, that we were conquered, we don't know much about modernity. They install it on us. Which city you see near to the paradox of modernity?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Of the cities I know reasonably well, so I suppose Buenos Aires is a good example of a lot of the history of the paradoxes. I mean, the kind of the Haussmann influence you can see there, everything since. I can see then the militarization of the spaces. I think so. I find Buenos Aires possibly the most interesting from that standpoint. I don't know Mexico City well enough to be able to sort of gauge its sensibility. I mean, Mexico City is such it's hard to grasp, and I'm not quite sure how to read it as an urban experiment.
I know that you have many things to do today, so I just make two more questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, when I read your work about Marxism and also saw your videos that are really good on the internet, one of the questions I have is, which kind of Marxist do you consider yourself? Or which are you near?
Well, for many years I didn't consider myself a Marxist. what happened in effect was that because I cited Marx a few times and, positively, people started to call me a Marxist. And I said I didn't really know what a Marxist was and didn't understand it, but I was called it and called it and called it. So in the end I gave up protesting and said, all right, I must be a Marxist. But I can tell you this, that I'm not very well rooted in the, if you like, the Marxist historical tradition. Given that my primary interests have been urbanization and uneven geographical development, I tend to read Marx for practical insights into what is going on around me in the world right now. And so I find the dialogue between, for example, when I was writing the theoretical book called The Limits to Capital and writing the Paris book at the same time, that dialogue was terribly important. Yes. And the things I emphasized in the theoretical book came out of my concerns in the Paris book. For instance, The Limits to Capital is one of the first books for a long time that tried to integrate finance and land rent and space and all those kinds of things into Marx's theory. But that came because I needed to know those things in order to write about property development. Yes. and land use changes in the city. So my reading of Marx has been both practical and it's also been connected very much to my urban interests. The result is that I think that the teaching of the Marxist texts, as a result, are much more appealing to a mass audience than those readings which insist that you understand Hegel and you understand, Spinoza and you read Althusser and da. And I have a sort of a critique of my fellow academic Marxists, and I say, well, a lot of the time you make Marx much more complicated than he already is, when I think our job is, or should be, to make it as understandable and open to interpretation as possible to a mass audience. And I think the success of the video series and of the companion books and of some of the books that I've written to illustrate how Marx in thinking can illuminate what's going on around us, like the book on the condition, on not only the condition of postmodernity, but the brief history of neoliberalism, that that is something which I try to contribute, and I think we need a lot more contributions of that sort from the Marxist Academy, rather than kind of getting lost in all of these kind of philosophical
rhetoric.
Rhetoric.
The second question, and it's important though, many students from the geography faculty and economy faculty are seeing this video, is maybe no two simple concepts that you oversee in your works, but I think that they are important for the students to know from you. The first one is, what for you is geography? And the second one is, what is political economy for you?
Well, the first answer is that geography is about the way in which human societies utilize space and place and relation to nature to construct a living environment of a certain sort for themselves, often in competition with others. So I think the concepts of space, place and environment are central to my geographical perspective. I don't think those concepts belong to a particular discipline. I am a bit antagonistic towards disciplines. I mean, I understand the need for some division of labour, But when somebody says to me, "Oh, that's not geography," or "Oh," then I think, well, that's a problem for you, not me.
Yes.
In my early writings, a lot of the time, I would have articles rejected because they were not, quote, considered geography. And I said, well, they're good articles, you know. I mean, you're just rejecting them because they're not good geography. And of course, they're not good sociology, and they're not good political science, and they're not good economics. But if they're good articles and they're none of those things, then what do you do? I think Marx, you know, is an interesting figure that way. I mean, is he a philosopher? Is he an economist? Is he a sociologist? Is he an anthropologist? What is he? And of course you can't. and when you reduce Marx to philosophical readings or to economic readings or anthropological readings, you miss much of what he's about. So my answer to the geographers is to kind of say, look, this is a fantastic way to understand what you're doing, but it's also a fantastic way to undermine the idea that what you're doing belongs in a box. It doesn't belong in a box. It's in this world, and the same applies to political economy. There are a lot of people around now who would call themselves Marxist economists. I often have problems with what they write because they lose the political. And many of them, for example, will look at all my writings on urbanization and say, well, that's his urban interest, you know. And I'm kind of going, well, you know, urbanization has been one of the big phenomena. I mean, I had this complaint about some of the Marxist journals in the 1970s, 1980s, that they never had a single thing about urbanization at a time when in Latin America, for example, the whole world was being turned upside down by the growth of Mexico, Sao Paulo, and everything. Phenomenal transformation, material transformation occurring in the world, which is not being acknowledged. And the same thing happened with environment. I mean, Marxists are now more sensitive on the question of environment, but when I first started writing, a lot of Marxists would dismiss this as petty bourgeois romanticism. And I remember sort of finding myself dismissed for that because I was interested and thought it was terribly important to have an environmental perspective. So there is this tendency to sort of to try to put Marx in a box, you know. And I think the Marx I love is the one who's perpetually exploding boxes and getting out of boxes and saying, goodness, there's something new here, incredibly new. And again, it's one of the paradoxes of life that Marx is often seen as a closed-minded thinker, when I find him one of the most astonishingly open-minded and thinkers I've ever had the pleasure of reading.
If a student wants to know your work, read what you have wrote, what do you think is the best route to read yourself, to understand your thinking?
It depends. How seriously you want to take my work. If you really want to take my work very seriously, you would take a text like Limits to Capital, which is a very difficult theoretical book, but you would read it alongside Paris, Capital of Modernity, and you would see that my interpretations of Marx do have a rootedness in a particular historical configuration. That what appears as abstract kind of thinking there has a concrete manifestation, and vice versa. You would see that the concrete reconstruction of what happened between, say, 1848 and 1871 in Paris has its roots in this theoretical understanding of what capital does and how it does it. But that's a very hard, that would be a very serious way to go about it. Otherwise, you can read, say, Rebel Cities, which I think is an interesting kind of urban book on the urban side of things. and you can put it together with a brief history of neoliberalism, which is on the economy side, or some of the later writings I've done.
Well, Professor Harvey, it has been a pleasure to talk with you
Yeah.
for this interview.
Right.
It's
Thanks.
been an honor.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.